So the next part, we would like to invite Paula Skurtzer to share with us on what it really means to be a leader within Good Shepherd Schools. Paula, a partner in mission, is a very familiar figure in the Good Shepherd congregation. In the past 5 years, she has worked extensively not only with many Good Shepherd units in Asia Pacific, but also with the CLT in Rome and Kenya. She's an educator by profession. She has conducted capacity development sessions on transformative leadership, facilitation skills, good cyber practices, and many more across many units in the congregation. And we are so blessed. We are really very blessed and privileged to have Paula with us today to share her insights on being an educator leader. Over to you, Paula.
Oh, thank you very much, Geraldine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can.
Well, I think only you will know best what it's like to be a Good Shepherd educator, not me. But I want to thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. I do feel like I'm with my people, educators. I was in the pink part of that pie graph, the 30 plus years as being an educator. So I feel quite old in this group as I looked at that pie chart. But I love the fact I was not alone. I was invited to offer some thoughts about leadership. And it comes at a time when I'm focusing my work on synodal leadership and the interior place that we operate from as leaders, our disposition as leaders. So what I share today comes from many different sources, and I will share those references at the end of this session. So let me share my screen. Okay, we can see everything okay? Okay. So today I want to focus on 4 parts. I want to briefly go back to the connection with Sister Winifred's words from last time this group gathered, and to connect people to the Global Compact on Education by Pope Francis. I then want us to look at synodal leadership and the pillar of communion. And then the bulk of today will be looking at vulnerability and courage in leadership. I think what we're trying to do here as Good Shepherd educators is focus on that we as Good Shepherd educators. But everyone here knows that before we get to the we really need to look inwardly at the me as a Good Shepherd educator, because it starts here from myself. You may remember these words from Winifred, that internal justice is all about relationships among ourselves, and the 6 calls to action inform us with the universal culture of justice at the heart. And you may also recall this part of her slide, that it begins with the individual, and the individual in relationship with others is an ever-widening circle of inclusion, relationship, influence, and partnership. And as leaders, and particularly as educational leaders, the importance on how do we include all voices, all opinions, and all ideas which are valued and respected. It's really difficult, I have to say. We're not perfect. So this is one of the foundational skills as a leader. How do we be inclusive? And what Winifred was talking about is in very close correlation with Pope Francis's Global Compact on Education. I just want to pull out a few points. Some of you may be very familiar with this compact. Some of you may not. It's okay. But in 2019, he launched an invitation to develop a new universal solidarity and a more welcoming society through the endorsement of the Global Compact on Education. So it is around renewing our passion for a more open and inclusive education, including patient listening, constructive dialogue, and better mutual understanding. He invites us to unite our efforts in a broad educational alliance to form mature individuals capable of overcoming division and antagonism and to restore the fabric of relationships for the sake of a more fraternal humanity. I also want to bring your attention to synodal leadership. As you know, the Church has a current focus on synodal leadership with 3 pillars of synodal growth: communion, participation, and mission. I could talk a lot about this, but I'm not going to. I would just want to connect us to this thought around this pillar of communion and what helps true communion. The synodal description for communion is: the mission of the Church requires the entire people of God to be on a journey together, with each member playing their crucial role, united with each other. A synodal church walks forward in communion to pursue a common mission through the participation of each and every one of her members. This is partnership. Synodal leadership requires ways of growing communion by increasing trust and strengthening relationships. So as leaders, how do we grow this essential element of communion and strengthening relationships? I think that this program, what you're doing now here together on a Saturday, AP educators invite synodality and calls for transformation. At these meetings, you are gathering to meet each other, to get to know one another at a deeper level, and to reflect together as you journey forward as leaders in education. This is communion. Each person is called to live communion through self-giving, union with God, and unity with our brothers and sisters. But this union is not uniformity. It allows and calls for diversity. And diversity, whilst ideal and what we aspire to, sometimes brings a lot of tension in relationships, in community, and in the workplace. Is that true for you? Have you ever felt tensions arising from competition rather than cooperation in our schools, provinces, and even with other congregations? Let's see a little yes or no. You know the yes or no button, the green or red button in the reactions? Have you ever felt tensions arising from competition rather than cooperation? Let's share what we feel. Yes or no? Let's have a look. We see a few yeses. So just press yes or no. Yes. Have a look around the screen. Have you ever felt competition rather than cooperation? Lots of yeses, some no's. Well, I want to come and work at your school if it's a no. Okay, let's keep going. Can you see my screen still? Okay. So we know that there is a great need to develop a spirituality of leadership that welcomes differences and promotes harmony in relationships. And a key skill of synodal leadership is how to deal with difference and see diversity as a gift, how to deal with conflict and address the root cause of it, how to build good relationships. Now, I work across a few different religious orders and have always worked in Catholic schools and Catholic education systems. In my experience, religious and educational leaders like to have everything go very smoothly. Sometimes we ignore or avoid or sweep things under the carpet to keep things looking like everything is perfect. Is that right for you? I can see some people smiling. I can say that I'm guilty of that myself as well. But, you know, interestingly enough, as a church body, we do not know how to deal with conflict. And as leaders, this is an essential skill and tool for healing. So I'd like to know, how are you at dealing with conflict? Not just avoiding it or working around it, but actually confronting it and working towards a solution. In the chat box, I've put a Mentimeter, and I invite you to click on the blue Mentimeter in the chat box and just address or respond to how are you at dealing with conflict? Not just avoiding or working around it, but working towards a solution. Just click on the Mentimeter. Let me share you the responses. Okay. Oh, I love your honesty. I really do. So how are we at dealing with conflict? We can see that no one there is excellent. We can see that some are very good. Some are not too bad, and some are terrible. Well, I would put myself in the not too bad section as well, I think. And I'd like to think that I'm working towards becoming very good. But the reality of it is, even myself, I'm not very good at dealing with conflict. I'd much rather avoid it. So how do we move this? As many of you know, I'm a practitioner of Theory U, along with some of your colleagues here, Sashi and Teresa in particular. So I'm just going to do a very quick overview of Theory U, because I think this ties into what we're talking about. Many of you are very familiar with this image. Where the Theory U is a framework for change, or trying to move into a new way of being. There are 5 movements of seeing, sensing, becoming present, crystallizing new ideas, and co-creating the future. I'm not going to talk about Lyra You today, but I want to bring your attention to it because I know many of you are familiar with this picture. And I know most of you are very familiar with the dispositions of open mind, of curiosity, open heart, of compassion, and open will, of courage. So having those capacities of curiosity, compassion, and courage help drive change. Is that correct? You're familiar with this? Okay. I want to bring your attention to this next slide. And this is what we call the absencing you, which is the inverse of the you. So instead of seeing, we're denying. Instead of sensing, we're desensing. Instead of being present to what the universe is saying, we become absent to what the universe is saying. Instead of crystallizing and becoming, thinking of new ways of doing things, of new ideas, we move into a blaming framework. And instead of co-create, we actually destroy. So the dispositions we operate from when we're in the absencing you is closed mind of prejudice, closed heart of anger, and closed will of fear. So we're working from a framework of prejudice, anger, and fear. So when we're talking about conflict, often we are operating from that part of the you. Have a look at that picture and think about, where do you mostly operate from? What is your default way of operating? Not where you hope that you're operating from, but your reality. There is a way to move from the absent seeing into the present seeing. And it's paying attention to your listening and becoming aware of where you are operating from. So if a big decision needs to be made, some self-reflection and self-awareness of knowing, where am I operating from in my discernment? Am I operating from a closed heart or a closed will? Or am I operating from an open heart and open will? It's really important that you know and understand where you're operating from, but also, where is your team operating from collectively? You need to know these things so you're able to shift from one to the other. And this type of self-awareness is critical for leaders in creating and maintaining right relationships. So I want to move on to this topic, which was introduced at the beginning of this session, vulnerability. Yeah, people talk about vulnerability a lot now, so I'm sure it's not new information. I really love this beautiful quote by Adrienne Marie Brown. She writes, "Right now, we are in a fast river together. Every day, there are changes that seemed unimaginable until they occurred." Yeah? Is this true for you, especially over the last few years? Every day has brought a new hurdle to jump. COVID has introduced so many different changes for us. According to Brené Brown, who is a leading researcher on vulnerability, you may have heard of her, and there is lots about her work on the internet. She calls vulnerability an emotion that we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And vulnerability invites having the courage to show up when we can't control the outcome. So when we're looking at that inverse you, we're operating from prejudice, fear, so forth, we know that that's when our vulnerability is most evident. So think about where or when you've been vulnerable over the last few years. And as I said, COVID is a really good example. So there is an incredible amount of vulnerability which we are experiencing. There's vulnerability in the church, in education, in our community, in the world. It's as if we are all arriving together in the same space where we are all experiencing this fragility and vulnerability. And even our congregational archives connect us with founding experiences of vulnerability and fragility. Just think Mary Fraser. Naming vulnerability calls us to a deep honesty and humility that creates space for conversion and change and even transformation. As painful as it is, naming our vulnerabilities invites a feeling of liberation and relief and potentially transformation. It is liberating for us. Once we let go of all the unnecessary suffering that comes from our exhausting and futile attempts to cling to what is no longer working, to control what is outside of our control, or to deny, blame, and shame ourselves or others for our suffering. Remember the you image. When we do not name our vulnerabilities, we are operating from the absencing you. Embracing our vulnerability requires that we embrace the fullness of our being, life's beauty and austerity, the full cycle of surrender, gestation and birth, and all manner of anguish and love. With each new cycle of life, in order for us to grow, we must not only humbly recognize our vulnerability, we must also embrace it. Some of you may know Cardinal Tagle. He asks, why do we turn away from the physical, emotional, psychological scars which are part of our human condition? Have we been scarred by the culture of perfection? Do we allow ourselves to acknowledge our vulnerability? Do we allow others to express their vulnerability? Do we model for our students our own vulnerability? Leadership requires that one becomes vulnerable, that we are willing to risk losing face or looking weak and being subjected to criticism and even rejection. This is the willing vulnerability that was practiced by Jesus. When we are open about our own weaknesses before others and before God, God's grace flows. When we are weak and vulnerable, we leave room for grace to pour in. In your leadership, where are the spaces for light and grace to flow in? These cracks represent our vulnerabilities and imperfections and are important because when we embrace them, then we can engage life from a place of authenticity, not this perfect, unrealistic offering. If we embrace our vulnerability, we can find new courage within as individuals and as a collective body of Good Shepherd educators. You know, I'll show you something. When Brené Brown was doing a session, she was working with some deaf interpreter sign language. And she came to understand there's two ways of signing the word vulnerability. Okay. And the first way is this. Okay, can you see? Can you do that with your hand and your other hand? It's weak knees. That sort of vulnerability, that is weak knees. That's not the vulnerability we're talking about. We're talking about the vulnerability, which is this. And when we sign, it's like this. Hearts wide open. Hearts wide open. So there are two ways of vulnerability. There's this or hearts wide open. That's the vulnerability we're talking about. Let me see you do this. Hearts wide open as well. Hearts wide open. It's a really good, when you hit that, you're actually hitting your heart and widening your chest. It's a really good physical thing to do. And there she is, describing hearts wide open. So embracing our vulnerability, living in the fullness of our humanity with hearts wide open is what transforms us. So here's a question for you. What makes you tremble most in your leadership? What makes you tremble most in your leadership? What makes you tremble most in your leadership? I have put a Mentimeter link. And if you wouldn't mind just sharing with us, it's anonymous, we don't know who you are. What makes you tremble most in your leadership? What is the hardest thing in your leadership? Just take a minute to click on the Mentimeter link in the chat and share your response. So we can see that on here, can you see okay? That our biggest fear, what makes us tremble, are the challenges, communication, fear of the unknown, facing difficult people, disagreeing with people, misunderstandings, being not good enough, being judged, difficult superior, dealing with conflict, talking behind people's backs. Okay. Inefficiencies, fear of authority, failing in service, not good enough. So a lot of those things are operating from that absence in you. Okay. And we're operating from that fear. So the question then is, well, how do we deal with that? Thank you for your honesty. And I'm sure more will come in and we'll share those at the end. I don't think we can talk about vulnerability without talking about its partner. It's married to this other thing called courage. Yeah? I'm incredibly moved by this image. Our spiritual leader in his own physical vulnerability. And as you can hear from my voice, I'm facing my own physical vulnerabilities over the last month or so with different viruses. And I'm sure you've all have your own personal memories and stories of courage shown in the face of threat and danger. Pope Francis reminds us that we are heirs to those who have gone before us and had the courage to dream. And these dreams were often born in times of vulnerability, times of great social need and scarce resources. It's not a matter of applying rules or repeating what was done in the past, since the same solutions are not valid in all circumstances. And what was useful in one context may not prove so in another. The discernment of spirits liberates us from rigidity, which has no place before the perennial today of the risen Lord. I love that word, rigidity. I think schools and education often operate on a skeleton of rigidity. So courage, of course, is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in the face of it. We sometimes, you might have heard us use this word, action confidence, not knowing what the outcome will be, but going forward anyway. And the root word for courage, as we heard, is heart. It means to have heart. So we need to dispel the myth, and I want you to listen really carefully here. This is so important. We need to dispel the myth and masculine and cultural norms that being vulnerable is some kind of character flaw. Somehow we have this myth that leaders are supposed to be strong. We bind ourselves to certainties and we mask our true emotions. We're supposed to arm ourselves against hurt and rejection and pretend that we are totally okay and calm when we are not. We are supposed to speak from our intellect and our head and hide our hearts. Is this true for you? You might have heard of this analogy, a duck swimming on a smooth pond. This is what others might see. This is how they might see you. How does she do it? How does she remain so calm in all this chaos? But what they don't see is this underneath. This is the internal reality. Let me just say that this portrayal of leadership is totally unrealistic, and it will result in failure and will affect your health. Brené Brown says the heart of leadership is vulnerability, a commitment to lean into vulnerability, to stay curious and generous, to stick with the messy middle of problem identification solving, to take a break and to circle back when it is necessary, through contemplation and discernment, to be fearless in owning our own part in the problem, and to listen with the same passion with which we want to be heard. It means showing up with an open heart and mind so that we can serve the work of mission and each other and not just our egos. Most of us know that we can feel brave and afraid at the same time. We can feel vulnerable during the moments when we're being pulled between our fear and our call to courage. Our foundational skill of courage building is the willingness and ability to engage with our vulnerability. Our ability to be leaders and synodal leaders will never be greater than our capacity for vulnerability. So often we think that courage is something that you are born with, but it is less about who people are and more about how people behave and show up in difficult situations. Fear is the underlying barrier to courage. There are many ways in which we can experience fear, but feeling fear is not the barrier. The barrier is how we respond to our fears. And too often we put on armor to protect ourselves from fear. And this armor is made up of our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors to protect ourselves when we're unable to engage in our vulnerability. It's at these moments we need to enter bravely into open mind sensing, curiosity, compassion, courage. So just take a second just to think, how do you confront your fears as a leader? Practicing self-compassion and having patience with ourselves are essential in the process of confronting our fears. And there is an intimate connection between trust and vulnerability. We need to be able to trust to be vulnerable, and we need to be able to be vulnerable in order to trust. And trust building requires risk. And often trust is born in opportunities, small and large, that happen in everyday life. So think about your leadership team, those very small things which happen in everyday life. But let me be very clear. Vulnerability is not disclosure. Vulnerability is not disclosure. Leadership requires you to create a safe environment where members feel safe to take risks and to be vulnerable in front of one another, starting with yourself and your team. It's a place where it's possible to have a difficult conversation without tiptoeing around the truth. This happens when people trust and respect each other, and the group won't reject or punish someone for speaking out. Remember that Mentimeter we just did? It's a lot of fear and vulnerability in those speaking up moments. So what must be avoided is judgment, interruptions, unsolicited advice giving, sharing outside of the meeting. The behaviours needed are listening, staying curious, being honest, and keeping confidence. So sharing needs to be appropriate. Boundaries need to be established, making it clear what can be shared and what cannot. Vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. It's more likely to be very fearful and an anxiety time, or it could also be manipulation. Okay, I'm just coming to an end now. So in summary, my final words to you are an invitation for you and your leadership teams. Naming vulnerability calls us to a deep honesty and humility that creates space for conversion and change in ourselves and in our relationships. This is the basis of our universal call to justice. The heart of leadership is vulnerability. So lean into vulnerability. Stay curious and generous. Stick with the messiness of problem identification and solving. Contemplate. Discern. And share what happened in your discernment with each other. Be fearless in owning our part in problems and to listen with the same passion with which we want to be heard. To lead with an open heart and mind so that we can serve the work of mission and each other, not just our egos. Thank you. That's all from me. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Paula, for sharing with us on vulnerability and your deep, deep insights as you have journeyed through many years of leadership within the school system as well as the social services. And thank you so much for